morning, everyone. I am sitting on the UNH campus and hearing the 8 o'clock bells chime from Thompson Hall. Welcome to the October Carsey Policy Hour. This is our monthly discussion series for people passionate about the issues and policies that shape New Hampshire communities. And we're getting deep into some of the most important aspects of New Hampshire communities today. My name is UC Terrell. I sit in Carsey's Center for Impact Finance, and it's a treat for me to facilitate these each month. As folks are entering, please type your name and organization in the chat so we know who's here today. As always, your questions and comments are welcome throughout the presentation and ensuing discussion. I'll include as many as I can, and we'll also follow up with the recording and slides. Thanks, as always, to our partners at the New Hampshire's Bureau of Education and Training. The BET's Certified Public Manager Program feeds into the Carsey School's master's programs in public administration, public policy, community development, global conflict, and human security. And also to our partners at the New Hampshire Municipal Association, which works to strengthen New Hampshire cities and towns and promotes effective municipal government through education, training, advocacy, and legal services, Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from Quixada Moore-Vissing and Michele Holt-Shannon about their hot off the presses 2024 New Hampshire Civic Health Report. Quixada is a Carsey Faculty Fellow and directs a civic engagement consulting firm called Public Engagement Partners. She is an expert on this topic, having co-written 4 civic health indices, including 2012, 2020, and 2024 New Hampshire Civic Health Reports, and also Maine's first report, which will launch this month. Michele is a familiar face to many of you. She heads up the Carsey's New Hampshire Listens program and is currently serving as Carsey's interim associate director. Michele, I'll turn it over to you to start.
Great. Thank you, UC. And hello, everyone. It's good to know there's lots of friends and some new faces out there. Our work with New Hampshire Listens really has a thread of civic health throughout our work around New Hampshire. We work on, pretty much any topic of public life that you can think of, from childhood lead poisoning, mental health, water sustainability, helping schools engage with families, working with local leaders, as they try and engage more people in the decisions that they're making. So really thrilled to be here today with Quixada and the good work that's been done on this report. And I just have to say from the beginning, in addition to my gratefulness to Quixada and her work, is just the whole team at Carsey that did a lot of work on this, and especially Laurel Lloyd, who really makes us look good every day. So thank you to Laurel and the rest of the team as well, which I'll mention more later. But good to see you all and looking forward to this conversation. And I'll pass to Quixada.
Thanks so much, Michele. Really a pleasure to join everyone this morning. And we're very excited to share the latest results of the New Hampshire Civic Health Report with you. So I'm going to share some slides here. So just wanted to start with a brief summary of what civic health is for those of you who are new to this concept. I know for some of you this is old hat, but for some of you this is new. So civic health is really behaviors, beliefs, and actions that related in some way to civic engagement. So these are the kinds of things that civic health can include, and what we've been measuring at the Carsey School since about 2009. So things like voting, volunteering, and community service, how much people help out their neighbors, if people are attending public meetings frequently, staying informed about the news and talking about both statewide, local, national issues, people believing that they matter and that they can make an impact in their communities, how much people feel trust in public institutions and in their community, and feelings of belonging. So there's more to civic health than this, but this gives you kind of a flavor of the sorts of things that we're measuring when we look at civic health. And civic health can really occur at multiple levels. So it can occur at the national level. So, if you look at our national civic health, I think we could all agree, maybe we have a little bit of work to do. We have some fragmented national civic health right now. You can look at the state civic health, You can look at civic health just in a city or region, or you could even look at civic health, at your workplace, at a university, in your apartment building. And today we're going to look at civic health at the state level, and that's what we've been measuring in New Hampshire is how we do as a state overall. So I want to share some key findings with you from the 2024 report, but just to give a little bit of background, as I mentioned, the Carsey School has been doing research on civic health since 2009. We've actually been doing civic health in New Hampshire in general since 2005. St. Anselm's College wrote the first civic health report. And we released a civic health report in 2020, which is pretty recent, that reported on 2017 and 2019 data. But then something big happened in 2020. Actually, a lot of big things happened in 2020, particularly the pandemic. But also there were other things that could affect civic health, including the killing of George Floyd, the 2020 presidential election, and the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. And so we thought to ourselves, wow, we really need to figure out what's going on with civic health more immediately than waiting a few more years, as we usually do, because there have been so many things that could affect how we're interacting across civic engagement in New Hampshire. So this study was really honed in on pandemic impacts. Some of the data are from the pandemic, some of the data are after, and we have some kind of pre-post comparisons at points. And we used two data sources. We used some supplements from the census, and we ran our own original poll through the Granite State Poll with the University of New Hampshire. And we've been running that poll. We've run some of those questions over the years so that we have some comparisons over time. So to the findings, we'll get right into the meat of things here. So one of our big findings is we asked New Hampshire residents how much they feel that they matter to their local community. And we found a major drop in feelings of mattering. So from 2019 to 2023, feelings of mattering to your community fell 30 percentage points. And you can see on the right-hand graph here just how drastic that fall is. Mattering was also different by age and region. And I share this with a little bit of a grain of salt because we had pretty small sample sizes on this. So I think that it sort of shows us that there may be an issue here, but we'd really want to do some follow-up research to confirm that. But some of the things that we saw by age was that there was a big drop in mattering from people aged 50 to 64. So, kind of older middle-aged folks. So mattering for that group dropped from 81% in 2019 to 38% in 2023. So big drop for that age group for whatever reason. And then we also found that in the North Country, mattering fell quite a bit from 85% to 34%. Again, these are small sample sizes, so we don't know for sure if this is a trend. It's something to sort of watch over time. But that's some of what we learned about mattering. But to go back to the sort of big picture in New Hampshire, big drop in the state in mattering. The other thing we found is that we're connecting less with others. And some of this, may not be surprising because of the pandemic, but some of it, may tell a different story in New Hampshire. So New Hampshire residents who do favors for their neighbors fell from 11% to 5%. People who work with neighbors to do positive things for the community fell a little bit from 27% to 21%. And Granite Staters are also hearing from, like on the phone or online, or spending less time with family and friends. So that fell by about 6% from 85 to 81%. To give some context here, if you look at the doing favors for neighbors, that's a pretty low number. It's a pretty low number nationally as well. The national average is about 10% of people in 2021 were doing favors for neighbors, but we're still, we're at about half that compared to the nation. So we're below average in helping out our neighbors. I think the question here is this decline in social connectivity temporary due to the pandemic? We certainly hope so, but this could also be connected to some bigger picture issues. National political divisiveness may be starting to affect local communities. There may be increased social isolation due to remote work. The fact is, we really don't know what's behind these declines, right? Those were just a couple things that might impact it, but we want to keep an eye on this. So far we're seeing, there's some community impacts, the mattering, the connecting less with others. Another trend that we saw is that New Hampshire residents are attending public meetings less. So from 2019 to 2021, New Hampshire residents' public meeting attendance dropped from 19% to 12%. Now we're still above national averages. And if I had to guess here, I would guess that this decline was probably because of fear of going to public events and maybe getting COVID-19 from them. So I would expect that we see a rebound on this if we measure it again in a few years. But if we don't, it indicates that there's something else affecting why people aren't attending public meetings. So that could be feelings of political apathy, dissatisfaction with elected leaders. So time will tell on this one. But I also do want to note something just in general. Even though we're above national averages, this is pretty low public meeting attendance overall, right? I mean, 88% of Granite Staters aren't attending public meetings frequently, according to this data. So we have room to grow in this area, and so does the nation. So another thing that we found, which is interesting, is that about a slight majority, about 53% of New Hampshire residents reported that they're engaging frequently with a person of a different racial, ethnic, or cultural background than their own. We also found that older people are doing this less than other groups. So just to kind of compare, a middle-aged group, right, 35 to 49, they were engaging across these differences at 63%. Compared to 30% of folks who were 65 or older. Interesting finding, but, and you could kind of interpret this two ways, right? You could say this is great news, a slight majority of folks are connecting across differences. You could also say, well, about 50% of people aren't connecting frequently across differences. So kind of depends how you slice this one and how you interpret it. So when we looked at voting, New Hampshire residents voted at higher rates than the rest of the nation in the last two national elections, so in 2020 and 2022. This is connected to a surge in voting nationwide in 2020. So voting was up in 2020, across the country. So that, but what happened with that trend line for us is that we still stayed above the national average. So New Hampshire residents were still voting at higher rates than the rest of the nation, even though everybody in the nation was voting more in 2020. But what we did find is that urban residents voted less than suburban or rural residents in the last presidential election in 2020. So we had 76% of rural people voting, for instance, compared with 57% of urban residents. So, that's something that we could still consider as we move into this next election is how to encourage, more urban voting and support that as well. I will also say here that we found that voting was impacted by age. Generally, older people tended to vote more, and by educational levels, with people with more education voting more. So that's something that we've seen in New Hampshire for some time. So another big finding, and this is, if you followed us in 2020, this is a finding kind of consistent from our findings in 2020. So we also found that trust in government has dropped since 2001 and has stayed low. And that's true for both national and local government. So trust in national government has fallen dramatically since 2001 from 31% of New Hampshire residents trusting government to 17%. What's really striking here is actually only 1% of New Hampshire residents trust the national government all of the time. And 49% almost never trust the national government. What I will say is there wasn't a huge difference between 2019 to 2024. So trust just kind of remained low since it had started to decline in 2001, which was the last measure that we had of this. This is helpful to think about with trust in government, that blind trust in government isn't necessarily a great thing. We want citizens to be sort of questioning government at times, but it does, I think, kind of speak to people's feelings about government, and something to be aware of. And then if we look at trust in local government, it's also fallen since 2001, not as dramatically, but it has fallen from 53% to 36%. And then again, similar to trust in national government, trust in local government stayed about the same from 2019 to 2024, but it was still low, right? So it had fallen from 2001 and stayed low. And then we have some new measures. So we don't have comparison points on this measure because it's the first time we've done it. But if we do this work in the future, we will have some comparisons. So we measured belonging for the first time, and here's what we learned. So we learned that just a little under 50% of New Hampshire residents feel they belong in their local community. 59% felt comfortable expressing their opinions in their local community, which means about 40% of people are not feeling so comfortable. 55% felt satisfied with their relationships with others in their local community, and 62% felt connected to their local community. So this is kind of an interesting finding alongside the mattering. People are not feeling they matter so much to their community, but they are feeling connected. So there may be a little contradiction here. So something to kind of watch those two variables together. And this is another measure that you could interpret positively or negatively, right? You could say most of these are the majority, or about 50%. So that's good news. Or you could also say, on a lot of these measures, about half of, New Hampshire residents are not feeling they belong, and that's not good news. So it depends how you slice the cake, right?
Quixada, I'm going to jump in a relevant detailed question. How is the belonging question worded specifically?
There were these are all sort of indicators of belonging, but I think the question was worded, do you feel that you belong into your local community or in your local community?
Thank you.
And then lastly, this is just kind of the last finding here, is that we didn't see major impacts on volunteering and giving. So it seemed like volunteering and giving looked about the same from 2019 to 2021. What's interesting here is that we did see a lot of activity around volunteering nationally, around the pandemic, people bringing elderly neighbors food, or, holding up signs for medical workers. So it's hard to know how to interpret this flat rate. It could be that there was just no change. It could also be that, there was a surge in some areas, like people getting their neighbors groceries, but volunteering and giving decreased in other areas, like avoiding public places and getting together with lots of people to volunteer because people didn't want to get COVID, and those canceled each other out. So we don't really know here what's behind the lack of change, but we did not see a change. But what I will say is that we saw that educational levels, age, and income are all associated with volunteering and giving, and that's been something we've seen in civic health indexes in New Hampshire over time as well. So I'll just kind of stop here, and then I want to pass it to Michele. But I wanted to show this civic continuum. So this is a concept I've developed that I think will help cue up some of Michele's talking points. Around how civic infrastructure and civic health and civic action all interact with each other. So the idea of civic infrastructure is that we need infrastructure to make civic life function. So for instance, some of this can be physical infrastructure, like do we even have places for people to get together, like a public park or a library? But it also could be things like, do we have transparency around our public meetings? So in your local community, is it easy to find meeting notes and videos if you weren't able to come to a public meeting, or is it buried on an obscure website that's super hard to find, and when you try to download things, you get an error message, right? So I think that those are both examples of civic infrastructure, but essentially good civic infrastructure facilitates good civic health outcomes. For instance, if people feel their local government is transparent, they're going to be more likely to trust government, right? So you can kind of see that link. Bad civic infrastructure is also going to facilitate bad civic health outcomes. So if a community alienates the voice and needs of a particular population, belonging and mattering are probably going to be lower, right? So, when we do these reports, what we hope is that they spark civic action, where based on some of these findings, different organizations and funders in the state will and policymakers will create interventions that potentially address some of these negative trends and build on the strengths that we have in New Hampshire. So I will kick it over to you, Michele.
Thank you, Quixada. That was great. And in addition to the ideas that you've raised throughout the key findings, I just want to point to a few things in terms of future work, and then I'm really looking forward to engaging in more of a conversation with all of you. A couple of things that we want to make sure that we're looking at is one that stood out was the voting patterns, and understanding that voting pattern of voting less in urban areas in New Hampshire, and then looking at some of those patterns in terms of linkages with how much people said they felt like they belonged or mattered, and even political identity in that difference. We want to keep tracking civic health indicators over the long term. So we hope to do this, every 4 or 5 years in terms of the larger version of this report. This is a shorter version so that we could capture this data post-pandemic. I think in terms of the core work for New Hampshire Listens, and really for many of us who are engaged in our communities, whose organizations, municipalities, nonprofits are very public facing, realizing the power of creating opportunities to build trust in communities. It sounds fluffy, maybe sometimes, but it really matters that people are actually engaging. Online counts, but face-to-face is really hard to replace. And we are noticing that there's more folks who are coming back into their involvement, and even wanting to meet in person in ways that we didn't for a while. And so recognizing that there's a chance to just greeting people, meeting people before a public meeting, making connections, asking people what brought them out and what they care about. It's just a way of increasing those connections, letting people know that it matters that they are there, and gives you a chance to keep connecting again with folks who maybe come out regularly, but especially those who are maybe showing up for the first time. For the work that we've been doing, again, with New Hampshire Listens, one of the things that we've noticed for a while is that even though the national spheres feels really fraught, there's a lot of power in what you can do locally. And so when you can get people together locally, when you can have an initiative, whether it's more family engagement in your school, bringing people together for, a town cleanup, involving people in the opportunity to shape what your town looks like, or some big decision that's being made. Those local ties, because people have more of a tie to their neighbors, to their community, that's where you have the most opportunity to strengthen those ties and to build civic health within your community. And that can pay off then, in a larger sphere. But starting locally is really one of the most powerful things that people can do, and one of the things that we really encourage. And you can build on what's already happened. You can build on the history of things that have happened in your community, or even a coffee shop, where people have started to gather. And then finally, I think the last, and the 2020 Civic Health Index, we had a little less than 50% where people were engaging across race, ethnicity, and cultural differences. We saw an increase there, but then Quixada noted that depending on the age group, there's a big difference, in terms of folks engaging across differences. And so finding ways to bring people together, especially, in rural spaces. I think there's a stereotype that that all of our racial and ethnic diversity is in more urban places, and that's simply not the case. We are seeing more and more diversity across all areas of New Hampshire. And so embracing that ability to connect across those differences is one of the things that we can do to focus on our ability to strengthen civic health and to recognize the strengths that come with the differences within and beyond our communities. I think that, I guess before we open it up, I'll ask UC to I'll come back in and engage us on these questions. Very interested in what you all are seeing and the patterns that you're noticing and things that you hope we all can pay attention to and things that you know that you can pay attention to. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Quixada and Michele. That was fantastic. I think you can go off slide now unless there's something that you want to refer back to, just so folks can see your faces. I'm thrilled looking at the chat and the roll call, what a cross section of New Hampshire we have here. We have folks from the civic sector, adult learning, volunteer transportation, other volunteer experiences, media, publishing, mental health and nursing, ACLU and Get Out the Vote volunteers, municipalities, funders, private sector, and all these are needed, right, that have a role in promoting civic action, leading to civic health, supporting the development of civic infrastructure. And I'm glad to see some of the comments start to roll in. I know that each of you on the call today has your own perspective. And as Michele said, please share what you're seeing, what patterns you see that relate, or don't reinforce what the most current civic health report shows. The first data point that just pops out here is the drop in mattering, right? It's huge, from 76% to 43%, and with regional implications, also age differences. Could you speak a little bit more about mattering in particular, how it relates to civic health, and what actions you've seen folks take to increase a sense of mattering in communities?
Thank you. I really appreciate the question, and it is a concern to see that large drop. When we think about this idea of mattering to communities, when we think about what it means, mattering to others is really, I think, the way that many of us find meaning in life, right? That we are connected to others, that they care about us. That if something happened to us, some people would be upset or show up. And so, I think there's a couple things to consider with this mattering outcome. So the U.S. Surgeon General has really been raising awareness around an epidemic of loneliness that we're in right now as a nation. And you may have heard the statistic that loneliness can be as lethal to your health as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. It's, essentially one of the new killers. And so this is where we kind of see civic health starting to affect mental health and physical health. And so when I think about mattering, I think it's so connected to other factors in civic health. So for instance, if we think about that variable around people helping out their neighbors. Well, if you are living in a community and you don't feel like you can ask your neighbors for help, if you're in a crisis or something's, or even not in a crisis, but you just need someone to help you move your air conditioner out of your window, right? And if you go to a public meeting and you try to share something that's important to you, and you find a public official to be dismissive to you and kind of shut you down, those are the kinds of things that affect how people feel like they matter in their communities. And if people don't feel like they matter, I think that then we see things like, does someone have someone who they can call in a crisis? Do they know someone locally if they need a ride to the hospital? Do they have, or they fell down, do they have someone to call? And I think that it can also affect depression, where we start to see people turning to substances, feelings of major depression or suicide. And so, to me, this is a really important finding to pay attention to. In terms of ways to help people feel like they matter, Michele, I wonder if you want to speak to that a little bit and some of the work that you do.
Yeah, I know. I'll just say for the last couple of years, I'll add another data point that I encourage all of you to look up about your own community. The Youth Risk Behavior Survey had the question, do you feel like you matter in your community, to ask young people. It was removed for the past 2 years, but they did add it back in 2023. I just found that out, and I'm thrilled that they added it, because when we have been in conversations with communities, it's very compelling. And people want to have conversations about whether youth feel like they matter in their community. So I encourage you to find that data point in your own community. There's a couple of other things that I just want to lift up. One is in the North Country, the Tilson Fund has been, and Phoebe Backler has been working with community stewards, and they have done a lot of things in the North Country to foster community and connection. It's a larger geographic space with fewer people, so there's been a lot of good work over the years. And this is a newer initiative, I think, just in the last couple of years. And the community stewards are they're making connections. They're meeting people, in schools and at meetings and in organizations, and really trying to do that weaving that maybe is hard to see at first, but then starts to pay off. And so I'm really excited to start to see the connections that the community stewards are making in the North Country. I'll also say, back to infrastructure, that I think is, the physical infrastructure where we live. My neighborhood is a front porch neighborhood. And so the houses have front porches, and there's a fair amount of interaction when people sit on their front porches and, somebody's walking by with their dog and saying hello. And it seems like a small thing maybe, but I was visiting a friend, and they all had back decks in their neighborhood. And it had an impact on the amount of interaction that they had. And I will say, my cousin added a front porch to their house in their neighborhood, and then a few other people did, and they saw a lot more interaction. And sometimes the physical layout of your neighborhood and actually can have an impact. So I'll share that as well.
That's very true. Comments are starting to come in the chat. Pon Nidachan from City Year noting that national service and community service build certainly a sense of belonging across differences, and also the sense of mattering, right? You can spend your time and effort to make a difference. Tanya from Miami says that a drop in mattering is not surprising for those already suffering from depression and isolation, and too few therapists and resources to support them. So this destructive cycle of those who might already be suffering from mental health, with this additional shift in overall civic health building on itself. A great question from Matt asking about, sorry, it scrolled up, the issue of trust. The findings of this report indicate trust is declining in government, yet some studies indicate it is really a shift rather than a loss. Who or what are people trusting more as their trust in certain institutions decline? Did you ask a question on that topic?
Yeah, it's a great question. I really appreciate the question. The trust questions that we asked was really just one type of question on trust, and there's so much that you can pack with trust. And there are national survey outlets that are doing a great job around that. Pew has done some really good work around sort of probing different aspects of trust, for instance. But the question that we asked was, how much do you feel you can trust? And then we had a few options that we inserted. So how much do you feel you can trust people in your neighborhood? Do you feel you can trust them a lot, somewhat, not at all? How much do you feel you can trust local news? How much do you feel you can trust national government? And how much do you feel you can trust local government? So those are the only data points that we have around trust. I do think it would be worth probing on this finding to try to unpack, where distrust and distrust lie. I didn't talk about the news and neighbors, but the trust in local news has actually, stayed relatively stable since 2001. In 2023, trust in local news was at about 60%. Trust in neighbors did drop from 2001 to 2019, and then has kind of stayed around the same. So there has been a little bit of a drop in trust in neighbors. We were at 84% in 2023 on that indicator. So that's actually pretty high trust in neighbors. But we have seen some declines in that. But I think, one thing that I've seen with some national data sources, which we didn't run in New Hampshire, but I think that trust sometimes in government can vary by who's in political office. So for instance, UC mentioned that I'm working on the Maine Civic Health Index right now. And in Maine, we did find some statistically significant differences between Republicans and Democrats, where right now Republicans are showing less trust in state and national government, but the state government in Maine is Democrat-led, and the national government right now is currently Democrat-led. So it's it would be interesting to kind of look at that over time, that if that flipped, right, if there were Republican leadership in a state or Republican national leadership, does that mean then Democrats are exhibiting less trust in government? So I hope that that's helpful to the question. I wish I had a little more to share, but it's a great thing to keep thinking about.
Yeah, I think the shifts in what these words mean and how to interpret them is striking to me. When the belonging results were about even at about 50%, which could be viewed positively or negatively. Even with high belonging, right? We'd interpret it as positive, but it could represent a kind of tribalism of the polarization and self-reinforcing media consumption. You hang out with people who are the same beliefs, have the same beliefs as you do. You feel like you belong, but it's in this narrowly bounded community. So any reflections on that piece in particular?
I'll just add that, in that regard, you see that, when you're thinking about whether the belonging or mattering is more about, being in the bubble. I was thinking about trust in terms of, we are being told, and I think it's a good thing to be aware of misinformation and disinformation. And so having more of a filter, for the information that's coming in, whether it's coming from our school or social media or the news or state government. And I wonder about the impact of sort of increasing that filter, depending on, who you're listening to. But it is good. I think we're all, going to fall for misinformation. It's very sophisticated. And so that makes me, wonder about how that impacts our sort of generalized trust. I'll say that we do a fair amount of work in schools, and I'm concerned about, the relationships between families and schools, because families, depending on how that relationship is, it impacts the student's experience in their education. And I think that's a link that I'm interested in thinking more about, in the future as well.
It strikes me that it's almost a higher order belonging. It's not belonging because you are in lockstep with the people around you, but belonging because there can be differences and you still feel safe and able to share those. There's some great questions coming in on the chat. Any data on proximity of family members, for example, or that is grown children or siblings or others?
So just, UC, I don't know if, just to clarify the question, did we see if as a sort of background demographic variable if people have family, if they.
Yeah, reading between the lines, I interpret this as people feeling more connected when they have family close by.
Mhm.
And in this report or in others that you're familiar with that speak to this topic, what are the implications of families that are tighter or more distributed geographically?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that can affect people's social connectivity. We didn't measure that as a factor, so we can't speak to that. But it is important. One thing to note about so there was a decline on the question of how much people are spending time with friends and family, but the way that question is worded is it's actually both in person and sort of remotely, like through the phone or through I guess it could be email correspondence or something. And so that declined overall. So that's kind of interesting because it indicates no matter if people have family close by or potentially far away, that there's sort of an overall decline. It'd be interesting to parse that out. This is kind of a wacky idea, but I was thinking that it'd be cool to do some kind of civic engagement project with post office workers, because I feel like mail carriers totally see if someone is socially isolated and, it kind of has a vibe on that. And I don't think we ever tap them, in terms of being a community resource in that way. But just kind of something that I've been thinking about lately.
That's interesting. I remember seeing on social media some hero story of a postal worker or delivery person who had the time to help out something that they saw was a little odd going on in the house. And it brings us back to the roles of that we conceive ourselves as playing professionally and how much time we have to to flex a little around the edges if we see something that would help somebody else. I know we can't have a survey that's too long. And so here's another question about a factor. I'm not sure whether it was in this report or whether you can speak to it more broadly. Was there any attempt to break out responses to questions of mattering and belonging by those who belong to faith communities in particular? We believe, we know, I recall that participation in organized religion activities is on the decline, at least the last time that I checked in on that area. And what do we know about its implications on mattering and belonging?
Yeah, great question. So I think that, Byron, I'll look back at this and get you this on email, but because this question is coming from Byron, but I think that in the 2019 report, we did collect some data around faith communities as a sort of demographic variable. We didn't do that in this last report, so we don't have that recently, but we might have that information for 2019. So I can go back and look at that. It's always so hard to pick which things we measure. I mean, the point around families is great. The point around faith communities is great. And I have a suggestion of how people could probe deeper on that I'll share in a moment. But I think some of the sort of civic engagement research does suggest that people who belong to faith communities generally feel more sense of social connectivity and support. So it is an important question. And it's also kind of interesting to think about in the context of New Hampshire being one of the least religious states in the nation, right? That a lot of us don't belong to faith communities in New Hampshire. And so where are other places sort of like that, where people could sort of regularly attend something and sort of intermix with a lot of different age kinds of people and get social support. So I think that's a good sort of innovation and maybe something for New Hampshire Listens to take on. One thing I'll plug is that we did develop a guide for communities wanting to explore local civic health. And so, our what you see is that we've measured civic health at the state level, but in different communities, even in different neighborhoods and in different religious group, sort of faith groups, there's going to be different levels of civic health. So if you ever wanted to have a community conversation about civic health at a more local or regional level, we have a bunch of tools to help you measure that and have community conversations about that. And I really hope that people do that, because this doesn't tell the experience of everyone, right? It just tells it at the sort of very top level, and there's a lot to dig into. Michele, I don't know if you have any other thoughts about this one.
Yeah, well, Laurel just put the link in the chat for that guide, and we've been sharing it. We've shared it with groups of municipal leaders, working on housing. We've shared it with local coalitions. There are a lot of tools in there. Quixada did a lot of good work on this guide, and Carrie Portree and Michaela Townsend and our team in Carsey. So it's really sort of getting started tools, and so hopefully you will take a look at that and find ways to use it, and let us know if there's things that we can do to help with. I think that when I think about civic health and some of the things that I see communities doing, I live in Dover. There's Dover doers, or they put plants on Main Street and hang the flags, around the 4th of July and those kinds of things. And it's and there are people who are packing food in backpacks, and there are efforts that are, from service to just fun things, public art. I was in Littleton, and they've got pianos on the street that people can stop and play. And so sometimes it feels maybe like it's overwhelming in terms of where to get started, but there are really small things that a few people can do that start to pay off and have ripple effects. And I guess I will just say is, don't underestimate what it means to greet a new neighbor, or join a meeting. I went to a one-time ukulele playing workshop that my Chamber of Commerce supported, and it was like an hour and a half, and it just felt community connecting. So think of that small things will pay off, I guess, is what I want to emphasize.
Yeah, Michele, you had mentioned schools and the role of schools in communities, and the report itself mentions the New Hampshire's new, as of last year, state requirement about civic education. And there's competency assessment required to cover the structure, function, history of the U.S. government, also the rights and responsibilities of citizens, and noteworthy government and civic leaders. I wonder if you both could reflect on the relationship as you see it between civics education and civic health. In one sense, they seem that one seems terribly academic and macro compared to what can happen in our daily lives, and on the other, maybe it's a foundation that we've grown away from.
The new requirement in New Hampshire is that to graduate, students take the citizenship test, which is different, from that, ongoing civics education, which is, I think, at its foundation, just understanding how the world around you works, how you can participate. New Hampshire Civics is an organization that is doing some great work in this regard. And I know that the social studies teachers in New Hampshire are an organized group that thinks about, what are we asking students to learn and engage in. We also know, and this is, I'm going to reach back to the longitudinal youth study that was done in the North Country, that when students are involved in their community and feel, like they are contributing in some way, they are more likely to want to, even if they don't stay right after graduation, if they leave for school or leave for a job somewhere else, they're more likely to return because they feel like they have that sense of belonging in their community because they've been involved, even beyond school, beyond home and beyond school, but in their community. And so I think that there's a lot here to keep thinking about, for an image that I have when I go back to one of the first times I walked into a public meeting in New Hampshire, new resident. Two things. The agenda was in the front of the room, and I didn't want to walk into the front of the room and get it because I'd be walking in front of everybody. The other thing is that the only seats that were left were in the first three rows. So I did sit down in the last of the third rows and realized the reason nobody was sitting there is because those rows are the ones that are on TV. And so it was just, it's these little like code things that when you walk into these opportunities of public life and you realize there's some stuff going on and I don't know, I don't know what's happening. And that feeling of not knowing over time can get amplified, or it can start to go away, because someone, greets you and says, let me give you an agenda. And, the reason a lot of people are standing in the back is they don't want to be on TV. So I'll pass to Quixada in case she wants to share more.
I definitely think everything you shared is great, Michele. And the thing I would add is I think a slight critique I would have sometimes around civic education is that it's very content focused. Like, do people know the difference between the legislative and judicial branch, and could they sort of could they like identify that on a quiz or something like that? To me, I think what might be more helpful in actually encouraging civic health is hands-on civic education that people can really use. And so part of that is certainly investing in helping people to become leaders in their community, and a variety of community leaders from different backgrounds and experiences and things. But I think the other thing is something that Pittsfield, New Hampshire actually did, which is more hands-on civic education. So Pittsfield ended up through Pittsfield Listens doing some work where they would open up, like, how does the school board work? And anyone could come to a meeting, but it was not a school board meeting, but more a meeting about how the school board operates. You could do that with the select board as well, because sometimes these systems that seem apparent to decision makers are actually kind of confusing for people who haven't used them regularly. And things like public comment can be really intimidating. And how do you actually get your concerns and voice heard? Another area that I think would be really rich around this, and it's not too late to do this, is around election transparency. So if people are worried about their votes being accurately counted in a local election, why can't the community sort of have an open house where they show people how they, manage elections and how they count votes, to sort of open up that community conversation. So I would love to see more sort of interactive civic education experiences like that.
I'll have to, I want to chime in because Matt listed this too as New Hampshire Together hosted a citizens assembly this year. And a citizens assembly is essentially, they work really hard to get a representative, political mix in the room. And so this political assembly was on voting and voting integrity, and they did bring in the machines and show them to people and talk about how all of that works. So there's a lot to say about that, but so check out that initiative. One of the things that we emphasize is that we have to interact with people who think and feel differently than we do in significant areas that we care about, our values. And it is, it's Jonathan Haidt who wrote, The Righteous Mind, says that, the only cure for bias is other people. And we all have to, I think, mitigate our own views becoming so hard that we're inflexible, or we don't see the complexity, or we don't understand another person's point of view. And just being able to be in conversation with someone who votes differently, someone who sees a moral issue very differently. It's good for us. And actually, even though some of us avoid it because what we see reflected in the media is so toxic, when people do lean in and have those conversations and there's enough of an effort made to really listen, it feels good. And people realize that it matters, and there's something about it that helps us feel connected in the bigger sense, even if we disagree on an issue in front of us. So I encourage people to be a part of those kinds of gatherings as well. I do have to thank our sponsors, which I meant to do earlier. New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, the Endowment for Health, Carsey School of Public Policy, Campus Compact, the New Hampshire Democracy Fund, and the New Hampshire College and University Council.
Well, we are coming up to the end of our hour. Michele, that was an inspiring close for sure. And the New Hampshire Civics, New Hampshire Together, all doing what Quixada, you were describing as almost thinking of civics education connected to civic sector, civil society, what it looks like outside of the concrete structures and processes of government to really how change is made in broader society. So thank you to those folks who are working in that area. Rounding it up, October 23rd, Quixada noted that Maine's Civic Health Report will be published through Colby College. So those who are looking for a New England view or to compare to New Hampshire, please check it out. Follow up with either Quixada or Michele about the Civic Health Report and indicators, broader New Hampshire Listens work, as well as other activities that lift up civic health in your community. Our next Carsey Policy Hour is on November 13th, which alert viewers will know is 8 days after state and federal elections, as different levels. We'll bring you crowd favorites on that day, Ken Johnson and Dante Scala, for a fireside chat of sorts to peel back how the election results came to be and to reflect on their implications. We can't give very much detail about that day because we don't know how we'll all be feeling at that point. December's Carsey Policy Hour will focus on municipal sustainability. So those municipalities on the call, join us there. January brings our annual New Hampshire Agricultural Policy Forum in partnership with the UNH Sustainability Institute and the Monadnock Farm and Community Coalition. That's building on from last year. Following this call, please do complete a 2-question survey on what time of day works best for you and what speakers and topics you'd like to hear. Any time change wouldn't take place until January, but we'd like to know what works best for you. We'll see you on November 13th. Until then, I hope we can all do what we can to increase our community's civic health in small and large ways. Thank you, Quixada. Thank you, Michele. And thank you all for joining us today.